All right, hello, welcome to our group presentation where we are going to discuss our replication of a study in which increasing physical activity through self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback. So first, I would like to talk about who our group members are. Sarah French, Mary Haggard, myself, Mary Haggard, Andrea Meyer, Erin Sheets, and Heather Dykehouse. So we're going to start by talking first about what the literature has said about this regarding this topic. So why target the increase of physical activity in individuals with autism? So physical activity in children with autism is typically lower when compared to typically developing children. The lack of physical activity can lead to many health problems, one being obesity. So according to Srinivas, Pescatalo, and Bat 2014, the prevalence rate of obesity in children with ASD is 30.4% compared to 23.6% in typically developing children of the same age. Also, targeting the increase of physical activity can actually, has shown to reduce problem behaviors in children in individuals with autism. So things such as aggression, stereotypy, off-task behavior, and elopement. So statistics such as these really show why it's important as practitioners, why we want to target the increase of physical activity in the individuals that we'll be working with. So now I'm going to talk about some interventions that have been used to target the increase of physical activity. Wack, Crossland, and Bittenberger 2014 used the combination of goal setting and performance feedback to increase the running distance in 5 women. So short-term and long-term goals were both set, and weekly meetings were held with the experimenter to discuss their performance. So they were given visual and descriptive feedback of their performance. The results in this study showed that all the participants had an increase in their running distance, so it was successful. So in a similar study, Lalonde, McNeil, Eversole, Ragazzi, and Poling 2014 used goal setting and reinforcement to increase this walking or number of steps taken in a day in 5 young adults with ASD. So pretty similar to the first study, a goal was set each morning. If the participant reached that goal, they were able to get a prize from a prize box, kind of as reinforcement. The results showed that the combination was effective and that all participants were actually walking at a minimum of 10,000 steps per day. So that's pretty significant number of steps. Also, the participants were able to alter their environment to reach that goal. So they were scheduling breaks in order to take walks to increase their steps in order to reach their daily goal. So lastly, Patel et al. 2016 used social feedback and financial incentives to increase physical activity. This study had a pretty large group of participants. There were 286. They were split into 2 groups. One group received financial incentives and feedback, and the other group just received feedback. So the results of that study showed that the combination was actually more effective than feedback alone. So the financial incentive really helped increase physical activity. But this study also showed that the group support was actually helpful in increasing physical activity. So the group members holding each other accountable or supporting each other was able to increase the physical activity among the participants. So now I want to talk about self-monitoring, because self-monitoring was a pretty big component of the intervention that we replicated. Romamzi, Dukes, and Scott 2015 did define self-monitoring as a covert process involving self-assessment and self-recording, enabling an individual to become more aware of whether he or she is performing a specific task. So in other words, that individual is responsible for tracking and monitoring their own behavior. Falkenberg and Barbetta, 2013, reported that self-monitoring is easy to implement, it's not intrusive, and it's low in cost, which makes it very, really attractive for practitioners to use. Self-monitoring is most effective when used in combination with other interventions. And just some studies that have used self-monitoring: Finn, Bermamsey, Dukes, and Scott, 2015, used self-monitoring to increase on-task behavior. And Falkenberg and Barbetta, 2013, used it to increase homework completion among participants. So this brings me to, or us, to the study that we replicated. Norman, 2008, used self-monitoring, goal setting, and performance feedback to increase physical activity. So again, as I stated before, self-monitoring is better in combination. It's more effective if it's used in combination with other interventions. So in here, it was in combination with goal setting and performance feedback. And goal setting and performance feedback, looking at our literature, it was commonly used to increase physical activity. So talking about our study again, 4 adult participants were used in the study. Pedometer was used to track the daily number of steps, in which the participant tracked their own steps. So that's where that self-monitoring comes in. The daily steps were sent to the experimenter through an email, in which the experimenter provided feedback. The feedback was dependent really on how well the participants were doing. So if they met the goal, they were given like something like "great job" or something along that lines. If they didn't meet their goal, it was more like "try again tomorrow," you know, you'll get it tomorrow, or "better luck next time." Face-to-face meetings were held each week in which each participant was given that verbal and graph feedback. So that's where that performance feedback comes in. And the results of the study showed that it was effective, that all participants increased their number of steps when the intervention package was implemented, and their number of steps decreased when the intervention was removed. So now we're going to go to Heather for the purpose of the study.
Hi, I'm Heather. The purpose of our study was to increase our physical activity through self-monitoring, goal setting, and performance feedback. Starting with goal setting, kind of just to reiterate on what we did a little bit more, aside from the study the Norman study that we replicated. So for goal setting, that's pretty straightforward. If we walked 8,600 steps one day, we would set the goal like, okay, I want to do 600 more steps the next day. And we kind of did that through self-monitoring by like looking at our Fitbit and our pedometer, or phone, or whatever it was that we used. And that was only in the intervention phase. We obviously didn't do this in the baseline phase. And through self-monitoring like that, that kind of let us set the goal to increase our steps. And around 9 o'clock every night for the week that we were doing our intervention, we would tell the group members how many steps we had that day. So if I had 10,000 steps, I would say, "Hey guys, I walked 10,000 steps today," and we would kind of get that performance feedback through verbal praise. And that a couple examples that we did were like, "Good job," or "Wow, that was a lot of steps. Keep up the good work." And if we didn't really meet our goal, we would kind of say things like, you can always walk more tomorrow, or, try again next time, or something like that. So yeah, that was the purpose of our study, and kind of the goal setting, self-monitoring, performance feedback. And I will hand it over to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint really fast. Alrighty, so I'm covering the methods section. 5 female adults recruited via our graduate school course, aged 25 to 32 years, participated in this study. All participants were healthy, non-obese adults who reported that they exercise regularly or semi-regularly as in the experiment that we were replicating. A permanent product recording system, such as the Fitbit or pedometer, was used to record the number of steps taken each day by participants. A step was operationally defined as any activity that resulted in a count being recorded or displayed on the Fitbit pedometer. Inter-observer agreement, IOA, was calculated once per week, a total of 4 times for each participant. An individual outside of the experiment was to walk with the participant for 3 minutes and track the number of steps the participant takes. An agreement score was calculated by dividing the smaller number of steps by the larger number of steps, multiplying it by 100 to yield a percentage. The participants will send one another pictures of their step count to ensure treatment fidelity and accurate self-reporting. Reliability measures were conducted for the daily self-monitoring and daily Google Hangout feedback components of the intervention by dividing the number of days on which each participant did not report their daily step total during an intervention by the total number of intervention days and multiplying by 100 to yield the percentage. Intervention integrity was 100% across all participants in the study. The intervention was introduced according to a multiple baseline across participants design. Additionally, an ABA reversal design was arranged for each participant. Unfortunately, Heather, Andrea, and Aaron were unable to complete the reversal due to time constraints. In our procedure, we started with baseline. To ensure the participants did not receive formal activity feedback during the baseline phase, the pedometers were masked / the Fitbit application was unopened during the day. Participants checked and tracked their daily step count each night at 9 p.m. Once participants had a steady rate of responding, they then would proceed on to the intervention phase. A return to baseline was arranged for only 2 of the 5 participants, but was kept brief to minimize the likelihood of reversing any health improvements. Goal setting, self-monitoring, and feedback was the next phase, which was our intervention. Daily step goals were established by tracking the number of steps taken per day and aiming to reach the same or more steps the following day. During intervention, participants wore their pedometers unmasked / they were able to open their Fitbit application throughout the day. And they were able to report their daily total steps to other participants through the Google Hangout. In response to each participant's step count, the other participants provided verbal or, written feedback through Google Hangout, such as good job, keep it up, or encouraging them to continue their effort, such as give it a little more effort, you can do it tomorrow, you can try better. Once per week, participants met through Google Hangout and discussed their progress throughout the study, as well as uploading their data sheets to the group discussion board. Once participants had a steady rate of responding, they were able to move on to the baseline phase. We also had a social validity survey handed out to each participant at the end of the study. The social validity survey was on a 5-point Likert scale, 0 indicating that they strongly disagreed and 4 indicating that they strongly agreed. There were 4 questions, and it was basically to assess whether the participants believed the self-monitoring, feedback, and weekly meetings were useful and their overall satisfaction of the study. Now we will move on to the results. But before I go into the details of my actual graph, I wanted to touch base on the components of the graph itself. So the x-axis is the horizontal line. For this particular graph, it represents days of the study. The y-axis is the vertical line. For this particular graph, it represents the frequency of the steps taken. The title of the graph is located at the top and centered. For this particular graph, the title is physical activity. Data points are used on graphs to represent the data. In this graph, each day the steps were tracked and they were represented by data points. Phase change lines are the dotted lines that separate the data points within each phase. Above each separated phase is the phase title. In this graph, the phase titles are baseline and social praise. The name of the participant that the graph represents is written in the lower right-hand corner. For this graph, the participant's name is Sarah, as in myself. Now I can talk about the results It's depicted in this graph. In the first phase, my first baseline phase, my data points were on a descending trend. There was little variability, and my steps were at a moderate to high level. My data points ranged from 7,717 to 8,466 steps, with an average of 8,069 steps. After the 5th day, my data points were stable, and I was able to move on to the intervention phase of the social praise feedback. In the intervention phase, my data points were on an upward trend. There were higher rates of variability, and my steps were at a high level. My data points ranged from 8,329 to 10,348 steps, with an average of 9,175 steps. After the 8th day, my data points were stable, and I moved back to the baseline phase. Once back in baseline, there was an immediate decrease in steps with an overall increasing trend. There was high rates of variability, and the data was on a moderate to high level. My data points range from 6,039 to 9,838 steps, with an average of 8,861. After 6 days, my data points were stable, and I was able to move back into the intervention phase. Once back into the second intervention phase, my data points displayed an upward trend, minimal variability with high levels from 9,408 to 10,182 steps, with an average of 9,803. After 5 days, my data points were stable, and I was able to conclude the study. Now we can go on to Mary's results.
All right, I'm going to pull up my results. All right, can everybody see it? Yeah, good, okay. All right, so the components of my graph are pretty similar to what Sarah said and the rest of my group members. So initially, I'm gonna first talk about the baseline phase. There is minimal variability in my baseline phase, an overall descending trend. There's a low to moderate level of steps, the average number of steps being 4,576.6. So to me, there's a good number of data points in this phase. There's 5. So at this point, it's the level of my steps, the trend is descending. So I decided to move into the intervention phase, where you can see there's pretty high level of steps compared to the baseline, an immediate increase. There's really no variability, a pretty clear ascending trend with high level of steps. The average number is 7,670.2. So again, there's a pretty sufficient number of data points in this phase. My data is going up, my level, my steps keep increasing. So at this point, I decided to go back into baseline. So there's a pretty immediate decrease in the number of steps in the first data point. So what happened in this phase was, the first 3 data points it really has an ascending trend. My steps are going up, so I kind of wanted to watch it to see, if it continues to keep going up, I would have stayed in baseline. But you can see at the 4th data point, it falls again, and then there's a descending trend. My steps are going down. So overall, there's a low to moderate level of steps, but it ends on a descending trend. So again, pretty sufficient number of data points going down. So I decided to move back into my intervention phase. Pretty immediate increase in steps, a pretty good jump. There is an overall ascending trend. The first 2 data points pretty similar. The third one, my little outlier there, is when I was in the car for 16 hours. We were driving back from Florida, so I wasn't able to get a lot of steps in that day. However, the next day there was a pretty immediate, increase in steps, and then ending on my last data point, pretty similar. As I said, the data is a little variable from the outlier, but pretty clear ascending trend. So I decided to conclude my my intervention. So overall, the prediction is that that implementing my intervention will increase my number of daily steps. I was able to replicate that by going back into baseline and then back into intervention. So the study as a whole really verified my prediction that implementing the intervention is going to increase my number of steps, and I was able to show a functional relationship. All right, so we are going to move to Andrea's data.
Okay, so here's my graph. And baseline, I stayed in baseline for 8 days, so a little bit longer than the 5 days, because at first my points were kind of showing a lot of variability, kind of was really low, and then I spiked up, and then I went back down. But then after the 4th day, for the most part, it was kind of showing a stable trend. So I moved on into intervention. For intervention, there was a lot of variability, and I did not get out of the intervention stage before we ended the study to go back into baseline because I just didn't have any stable data. My prediction for why it's very scattered is because the clients that I work with, it depends on what's reinforcing to them as to what I do. So if I have a kid that wants to go play tag a lot or wants to run around, then I'm up more and doing more. If I have a kid that prefers to watch the iPad or play computer games, then I'm sitting more than I would be. And now we will go to Heather's graph.
Okay, let me pull up my graph for you. Okay, here is my graph. As you can see, I had to stay in baseline for quite a while, to be exact, 18 days. As you can see, I have, low variability here, and we got some moderate and then pretty high steps going on here. There were just so many variables that I just never ended up having any stable data. And that was just due to things like the weather, clients canceling, so I wasn't walking as much, or I had clients that had restrictions of doing things. Or on the weekends, if it was a weekend where we had an exam, I wasn't moving around as much. So I could really just never get any stable data until about the last 3 days here. It was kind of on a little bit of a steady trend, so I decided to move into the intervention just so I could experience the feedback and whatnot. As you can see, I again have some variability, especially here. So, I mean, my prediction was that I would have had a increase in steps, but I feel like the routine that I had for my work, that given like the positive feedback and whatnot, that it just didn't work for my daily schedule. So as you can see, it's here on a downward trend, and I unfortunately never got to move back to baseline because the study that we were doing was over. If I go here to the next slide to my data, for baseline, my average was about 6,000 steps, but it ranged between 872 to just a little over 11,000. And then once I was in treatment, my average is about 7,000, and then my range was from about 2,200 to just over 12,000. And now we will move on to Erin's graph.
Hi guys. Due to some technical difficulties, we can look at my graph on paper and talk about it. So here's what my graph looks like. My data shows great variability. It took me 14 days to leave the baseline phase. I didn't have a steady state in intervention, so I was unable to return to baseline. I think if I would have had more time to continue the experiment, I would have eventually returned to baseline. But due to factors such as weather, and I was sick a couple days and I didn't really do much walking, it made it hard for me to get to that steady state. And due to this high variability, it's difficult to determine a trend or make any kind of prediction based on this data. My average step count during baseline was 3,796, and it ranged from 235 to 8,266. My average step count during the intervention was lower and was actually 3,412, with a range of 507 to 6,181. So from there, we can discuss the limitations of the study. Let me try to turn back around. Sorry, guys. So this study has several limitations. As in the original 2008 study by Normand, one limitation is the lack of maintenance data. So it's unclear participants would continue to walk an increased number of steps after the experiment ended. Another limitation is that it was difficult for participants to achieve a steady state of responding in order to move to the next phase of the experiment. If the experiment lasted longer, participants may have had more success in changing phases. A third limitation is that it was challenging to remember to check in with the group members each day. Because we were all at different phases of the experiment, we couldn't really rely on each other to remind each other to check in and discuss our step count. Finally, social praise proved to be pretty ineffective as a reinforcer. And as mentioned in our original study by Normand and the studies that Mary cited earlier, participants may show a greater increase in step count when they're given other incentives such as tangibles.
Okay, now I'm going to do the conclusion. The goal of our study was to increase the physical exercise by goal setting, self-monitoring, and social feedback. All 5 participants used a pedometer or a Fitbit or their phone to track the amount of steps each day that they walked. During the baseline phase, the tracking device that they used for their steps was covered or taped so that they couldn't see the steps that they took during the day. After baseline during treatment, then you could see the steps that you took. At the end of each night at 9 p.m., we'd write in Google Hangouts the amount of steps that we took during the day. If the steps had increased from the day before, then we would give each other feedback such as good job, way to go, that was really, great walking today. If the steps were the same or had decreased, we'd give feedback such as you'll get it tomorrow, try again, things like that. Some results as a group was that 60% of us did not get enough stable data to move on from treatment into baseline again. And also 60% of the group had less steps during treatment than they did in baseline. As a group, we concluded that social praise was not reinforcing enough to increase our steps daily, that we needed a greater reinforcement, such as a tangible, to help us meet our goals. Now I'm going to show some slides of our IOA data tracking sheet and our social validity survey. Here's our data spreadsheet that we used that had the 4 weeks that we conducted the experiment, and then the days of the week. We would put our daily count for each week, for each day. Below is also the IOA data. So it had the 4 trials that we did, what instrument we were using to track our steps, and then someone else was walking beside us for 3 minutes with another tracking device. And then we took the smaller number and divided it by the bigger number and multiplied it by 100 to get our IOA percentage. Here's a list of our individual contributions. And here is a example of the social validity survey. It had some questions on it that we answered, and we answered it with 0 being strongly disagree and 4 being strongly agree. And then finally, here's our reference page. And that concludes our group presentation.
All right, nice job. I have a couple of just questions to discuss. I was wondering if all of you use like an actual pedometer or Fitbit, or if some of you use apps on your phone, or kind of what that looks like.
I use a Fitbit.
Fitbit.
Pedometer.
I used an app on my phone.
So did you run into any problems, I guess, Erin, for not having your phone like on you all the time? Because I'm guessing the others had.
I actually did.
Okay, because that's something that usually comes up. A lot of people who've done similar studies in the past have said, you know, it's not possible to have your phone on you 24/7. So was that your experience?
Well, for us, because we were like ending our step count at 9 o'clock every day, it wasn't a huge issue. Like if I was somewhere at night, there was one day during the study where I was at a family cookout and I left my phone inside. So I was walking, but I didn't get that data because I didn't have my phone with me.
Okay. And then I guess the rest of you as well, ending at 9 o'clock, do you feel like that like impacted your results at all? Were some of you getting additional steps after 9 o'clock that you don't feel like were reflected in your graphs?
I probably could have had more. I played with late night volleyball league, and I definitely got more on those days.
I would agree, Sarah. I feel like I was pretty active after 9 o'clock, which could have been a lot more data that could have been recorded down for the study.
For me, no, just because I have 2 kids and my bedtime's like 10 o'clock. So at that point at 9, I'm usually winding down, you know, sitting down watching TV. So to me, I'm not that active after that time. So I thought that was doable for me.
Okay.
I would agree with Sarah and Heather, because a lot of times when I get home from work, I do homework and stuff first, and then I do like dishes and laundry and all of that afterwards. So a lot of times that was after 9.
Okay. And then did you guys notice any differences in terms of your reliability of your data based on the devices that you were using when you did your IOA checks? Were there certain, like the Fitbits were more reliable forms of data collection than using the app on your phone? Or were they all pretty consistent?
I think mine was pretty consistent.
Pretty
And I use a pedometer.
Looking at everybody else's like data, though, I feel like our IOA was all around the same. But I just know that my Fitbit counted more steps.
Okay.
About it.
Okay.
It wasn't a lot more, but it was more like each time.
Okay.
I had the same issue, Sarah. Mine counted more steps than what the person who was helping me counted.
Okay.
Mine actually counted less.
Okay. Is that reflected in your IOA data that you guys reported?
Yes.
Okay. One other question that I had kind of about methods. So you guys covered the pedometer during baseline, right? So that you couldn't see the number. But how often were you actually, like, were you entering it every day at the end of the day, or did you wait several days before you entered it? What did that look like?
We entered it at 9 o'clock. Even when we were baseline, we just didn't open the app or look at the pedometer until 9.
Gotcha. So I would address that as a consideration when you're writing up your paper and thinking about the findings in terms of like self-monitoring. even though you weren't like all day looking at your steps, you were still getting the feedback by looking at the end of the day to see how did I do compared to the day before. So if you were to replicate the study in the future for future groups, one thing that I probably would recommend is that you there are some devices that you can look back at, see what the previous day's data were, so that you weren't getting that feedback even daily. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think that impacted your performance at all? The fact that you were getting at least the daily feedback on your Fitbits or pedometers, indicating how many steps you got that day?
I'm a really competitive person, so I actually tried to meet my goal.
Yeah.
It took me a while to actually get into the intervention phase. But I feel like I was on such a routine that getting that social praise or written praise didn't really affect increasing my steps or anything like that.
Okay.
I agree with you, Heather. I just didn't feel like even myself seeing my number of steps really meant a lot to me, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. And then one other thing that kind of surprised me. So the first two of you guys that presented your data, it looked like there was a pretty strong treatment effect, especially for Mary. Your data looked ideal in terms of a treatment effect. But I was expecting then some of you guys continued in baseline for a while because your data was so unstable. And so one thing that I was going to mention was that sometimes it's okay to move into intervention sooner. So you wouldn't want to move into intervention if you're on an upward trend. I think, Andrea, your data were on a clear upward trend. And so yeah, you want to wait, make sure that you need an intervention, but sometimes when the data is so variable during baseline, it's okay to start intervention to see if the data will even stabilize a little bit as a treatment effect. So I was surprised that for those of you guys that did wait, that you still really didn't see very much stability in your data even when you started intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So. I don't think that I have any other questions. So you guys can go ahead and just post your video to the discussion board that you're assigned to, and then I will send you your rubric with your grade on it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Have
you.
a great night.